The rewriting of the 1927 film, The Lodger by Alfred Hitchcock. Chapter 1, The Fog Descends. London always walked with a certain weight in winter, but on that night the city felt burdened by something heavier than cold. A river fog, thick, yellowed, and reluctant to lift, rolled through the streets like an animal that had lost its way. It clung to window panes, curled around lampposts, and swallowed the shape of every building it touched. It was the kind of fog that made honest people hurry home and dishonest people feel at ease. On the narrow street where the Bunting family lived, the gas lamps flickered as though suffocating. Behind the glass of the front window, Mrs. Ellen Bunting pressed her handkerchief to the pane, squinting at the shifting blur beyond. The newspaper boy's voice had faded for the night, but she could still hear the echo of what he had shouted hours earlier. Another girl. Third this month. The Avenger strikes again. Ellen stiffened at the memory. It wasn't that she expected the murderer to appear out of the fog and knock on her modest front door, it was that London no longer felt like a place where such a thing couldn't happen. Fear had become as common as coal dust, it settled on everything. Behind her, the clock on the mantel ticked in uneven rhythm. Her husband, Robert, coughed from the armchair, a thin, tired cough, the kind that made her purse her lips in worry. "Shall I put more coal on?" she asked. "No, save it." Robert leaned back, staring at the ceiling. His breath created a small cloud in the chilly air. "We'll make do." Ellen didn't reply. Making do had been their life for the past year, scraping from one day to the next, hoping for a lodger who stayed more than a week, praying for money that never stretched as far as it needed to. She pulled her shawl tighter and drifted toward the small table where the rent ledger lay open. The blank space under "payments due" looked merciless. She dipped her pen into the inkwell, hesitating, as if her hesitation alone might produce a miracle. A soft creak came from the staircase, the old house settling, or perhaps the footsteps of their daughter, Daisy, returning from her shift at the dressmaker's. But no footsteps followed. Just that one creak. The fog pressed harder against the windows. Somewhere far off, a police whistle cut the silence, long and sharp. Another warning. Another discovery in some alley people would try not to think about. Ellen exhaled shakily. She turned from the ledger, ready to close the shutters, when a shape materialized beyond the glass, a tall, dark silhouette emerging slowly from the fog, as though it had been carved out of it. The shape paused at the Bunting's gate. Then it moved toward the door with a deliberate, purposeful stride. Ellen's heart gave a startled jump. A knock sounded, not frantic, not even loud. Just certain. Robert sat up. At this hour? Ellen swallowed. Perhaps Daisy forgot her key. But she knew the silhouette had been much too tall, much too still, to be her daughter. The knock came again, a slow, patient rap, as though the visitor fully expected to be let in. Ellen gathered her courage and opened the door. The fog spilled in first. Behind it stood a man in a long coat, collar turned up, hat pulled low. His face was partially shadowed, only a pair of pale, steady eyes met hers. "Good evening," he said. His voice was soft but unhesitating. "Forgive the intrusion. I was told you might have a room to let." Ellen blinked, unable to speak for a moment. The lamplight behind her cast a warm halo around her shoulders, but the man remained untouched by it, a figure cut from night. Yes, she managed. "Yes, we have a room available. I'd like to see it." His tone was polite but controlled, the words of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Robert cleared his throat in the parlor but made no move to rise. Ellen stepped aside, letting the stranger into the narrow, dim hallway. He brought with him only a single leather suitcase, worn, but not cheap. "This way," she said, her voice steadier now. As they climbed the steps, Ellen felt an inexplicable chill that had nothing to do with the house's inadequate heating. Each footstep of the man behind her was soundless, as though he were careful not to disturb the old wooden boards. She led him to the guest room on the second floor. It was small but tidy, a brass bed, a washstand, a chest of drawers, and a window overlooking the hazy street below. The man entered and stood very still, surveying the room without touching anything. "This will do," he said after several seconds. "You're welcome to stay as long as you need," Ellen replied. "We only ask." Before she could finish, the man reached into his coat and withdrew a wallet. He placed several neatly folded banknotes on the small table. "For the first week. In advance." He paused, then added another note. "And for the inconvenience of the hour." Ellen stared at the money, throat tightening. It was more than they'd been paid in months. Thank you," she breathed. He inclined his head slightly, no smile, no warmth, just acknowledgement. Then he set his suitcase beside the bed and began to remove his gloves with slow, precise movements. Ellen backed toward the hallway, suddenly aware of her own heartbeat. "If you need anything," she said, "just ring the bell by the stairs." "I won't." His answer was simple, but something in the way he said it made her fingers cold on the doorknob. She descended to the parlor in a daze. Robert looked up, surprised. "Well? Who is he?" Ellen closed the door behind her and pressed a hand to her chest. I don't know," she whispered. She glanced at the window, at the fog curling hungrily around the lamplight outside. "But he's upstairs now." The clock resumed its uneven ticking. And somewhere above, on the second floor, a single, measured footstep sounded, as deliberate as the knock that had brought him to their door. Chapter 2, The Lodger Arrives. The house had always been quiet at night, but now the quiet felt inhabited. Even after Ellen returned to the parlor, even as she poured a small portion of tea to steady her nerves, the presence of the man upstairs seemed to thrum faintly through the walls. The fog outside muffled the world, and inside, everything else fell away. Robert was the first to break the silence. "Well?" he asked, hands folded over his thin coat. "Will he stay?" Ellen nodded slowly. "He's paid for a full week." "Generously." Robert let out a breath he must have been holding. It came out in a wheeze. "Well, that's a blessing, isn't it?" "Yes," Ellen said, though her voice carried uncertainty. "A blessing." For a moment, she wondered whether she should tell him about the stranger's eyes, pale, unblinking, and unsettlingly calm, or the strange quietness with which he moved. But Robert was ill and worn thin. Worrying him wouldn't help. She folded her hands. "He said he won't need anything." "That's fine by me," Robert muttered. "Quiet sorts make the best lodgers." The clock struck the half-hour with a dull clang. The sound seemed to travel up the staircase and disappear beneath the lodger's door. Upstairs, the man had unpacked his suitcase with the same precision he showed in everything he did. A few neatly folded shirts, a toothbrush, a small leather-bound notebook, no clutter, no personal trinkets. He placed each item as though performing a ritual. Then he approached the window. The street below lay half-drowned in fog, its lamps dim halos in the murk. The faint outlines of houses stretched in uneven rows, indistinct and wavering. The lodger watched the street for a long time, unmoving. A carriage rattled past somewhere far off, the horses' hooves sounding dampened, as if the fog swallowed them whole. The lodger closed the curtains. He turned toward the framed portrait above the washstand, a bright, cheerful advertisement of a smiling woman holding perfume. He stared at it, unblinking. His jaw tightened. After a long pause, he reached up and gently turned the frame face down. Then he did the same to the smaller portrait by the bedside, a sketch of an actress, youthful and carefree. One by one, with the same measured care, he inverted every image in the room that bore the smiling face of a woman. When he finished, he stood in the center of the room, hands at his sides, breath slow and deliberate. Only then did he sit at the small table and open his notebook. Inside, the pages were filled with names, each written carefully, in elegant script. Some were crossed out. Some were not. He placed his hand flat on the most recent name, resting there for a long, quiet moment. After a time, he closed the book. Then he listened. Downstairs, Ellen and Robert heard it, a soft, rhythmic pacing from the second floor. Not hurried. Not restless. Measured, like the ticking of a metronome. Ellen looked toward the ceiling. "He's walking," she whispered. "A man's allowed to stretch his legs," Robert said, though even he sounded unsure. But Ellen could feel something in that pacing, something cold and unwavering, as though the steps belonged not to a tired traveler but to someone methodically assembling thoughts in the dark. Tap, tap. Turn. Tap, tap. A pattern. A ritual. It went on for nearly an hour. By the time the footsteps ceased, the tea in Ellen's cup had gone cold. She rose abruptly. "I'll check on Daisy," she said, though she had no real reason to. It just felt necessary, a sudden surge of protectiveness she couldn't explain. She climbed the stairs, carpet fibers brushing softly beneath her feet. When she passed the lodger's door, she slowed. The room was silent now. But she sensed him there, fully awake, listening to whoever might be listening in return. A faint draft crept from beneath the door. Ellen shivered and moved on. Daisy slept soundly, her blonde curls spread over her pillow. Ellen brushed a strand from her daughter's face, feeling a quiet relief settle in her chest. Returning to the hallway, she hesitated again by the lodger's door. Should she knock? Introduce herself properly? Ask if he needed hot water? But instantly, she knew the answer was no. Every instinct in her, instincts shaped by years of keeping a careful house and reading people with caution, whispered the same warning. Leave him be. She descended the stairs. Behind her, in the stillness of the landing, the lodger's door slowly, silently clicked shut. As though it had been ajar a moment before. As though someone had been standing just behind it. Listening. Later that night, when the house had gone completely still, a faint light flickered under the lodger's door. A shadow moved across the ceiling, long, narrow, like the shape of someone leaning closely over a table. A pencil scraped softly on paper. The lodger, coat still on his shoulders, was sketching. Lines, curves, circles, the shape of a face beginning to form. A woman's face. Her expression half-finished, eyes blank, mouth only suggested. As he shaded the cheekbones with delicate strokes, a sound rose faintly through the thick fog outside. A police whistle. Another. The lodger paused. The pencil tip hovered above the page. Then, with a quiet exhale, he crossed out the unfinished drawing with a single, clean line. He closed the notebook. Blew out the lamp. And lay awake in the dark, perfectly still, until dawn. Chapter 3, Odd Habits. Morning crept slowly into the house on that first full day of the lodger's stay, its pale light seeping through the curtains as though reluctant to disturb anything inside. The fog hadn't lifted, if anything, it had thickened overnight. From the kitchen window, Ellen could barely see the opposite side of the street. The world looked blurred, unfinished, like a sketch awaiting its final lines. She stoked the fire, coaxing warmth into the air. As the kettle began to hum, she heard the familiar sound of Daisy's footsteps bouncing down the stairs. "Morning, Mum," Daisy said brightly, tying her apron. She seemed oblivious to the chill in the room, the worry in her mother's face, or the heavy mood that floated through the house like dust. "Morning, dear." Ellen forced a smile. "Toast will be ready in a moment." Daisy leaned against the doorframe, brushing a curl from her cheek. "Did our new lodger come down?" "No," Ellen replied, glancing toward the staircase. "Not yet." It was nearly 9. Most lodgers, especially respectable ones, were up and out by dawn, making the most of whatever business brought them to the city. But the man upstairs remained silent. Too silent. Maybe he's tired after all that traveling, Daisy offered kindly. Perhaps, Ellen murmured, though her voice lacked conviction. Daisy hummed a tune and began arranging the breakfast plates. The warmth of her presence filled the room like sunlight in a darkened hall. Ellen cherished it. And yet, beneath her fondness, a tendril of unease curled quietly. She had checked the lodger's room twice in the early morning hours. Once, she thought she heard the faint scrape of a chair. The second time, there was nothing but the muffled air of someone deeply awake, the kind of wakefulness that listens rather than moves. At 9:30, a soft tread sounded on the stairs. Not Daisy's youthful bounce, not Robert's tired shuffle. A steady, deliberate descent. Ellen turned. The lodger appeared in the kitchen doorway. He was dressed impeccably, as he had been the night before, dark coat buttoned high, collar forming a narrow shield around his throat. His pale eyes flicked briefly between Ellen and Daisy before settling on the table. "Good morning," he said, quietly. "Good morning," Ellen replied at once. Daisy echoed her cheerfully. The lodger inclined his head, expression unreadable. He removed his gloves with meticulous care and placed them on the chair beside him before sitting. His movements were smooth, careful, almost unnaturally controlled. "We've toast, eggs, and some jam," Ellen said, suddenly uncertain whether she should ask what he preferred. "Tea will be sufficient," the lodger replied. "Thank you." He folded his hands. They were slender, almost elegant, though his knuckles looked faintly bruised, as if from gripping something too tightly for too long. Ellen poured the tea and noticed how he avoided the plate with the jar of strawberry jam. It wasn't the food he avoided, it was the label, a smiling girl with rosy cheeks holding a basket of berries. His gaze momentarily hardened, then he turned away. Daisy, oblivious, pulled up a chair. "Are you visiting London, sir?" The lodger hesitated just long enough for Ellen to feel the room tighten. In a manner of speaking, he said finally. "There is something I must resolve." His tone was polite, but the words landed with a peculiar weight, as though he carried them like a burden, not a simple explanation. Daisy opened her mouth, but Ellen shot her a warning glance. The lodger sipped his tea. The steam drifted toward his face. He watched it dissipate with unnerving stillness. After a long moment, he set the cup down and rose. "If you don't mind," he said, "I'll take my meals in my room." Ellen blinked. "Of course. If you prefer." "Thank you." Without another word, he collected his gloves and exited, ascending the stairs soundlessly again, like a shadow returning to its rightful corner. Daisy exhaled dramatically. "Well. He's an odd duck." "He pays on time," Ellen replied. "That's what matters." But even as she said it, a small knot tightened in her stomach. The oddities multiplied as the days unfolded. At night, the pacing resumed. A soft, steady pattern above their bedroom. Tap, tap, turn, tap, tap. Long stretches of quiet, followed by sudden bursts of movement. Sometimes, the lodger opened his door at 2 or 3 in the morning, letting a thin strip of light fall across the landing before closing it again. Ellen lay awake listening more than once, wondering what sort of man preferred to wander within his own room long after the city slept. He refused meat. He never touched jam. He declined sugar. He spoke little, though always with precise courtesy. He left the house at odd hours, often after dusk, sometimes before dawn, always wrapped tightly in his long coat, collar up, hat brim low. And when he returned, his boots were often damp with dew or wet with a residue of fog that clung too heavily for ordinary street walking. More troubling still, Ellen noticed something strange about the way he viewed Daisy. Not with desire. Not with admiration. With fear. A quiet, startled fear, the kind an animal shows when confronted with something that reminds it of an old wound. Once, when Daisy laughed at something she read in the paper, a cold, flickering shadow passed across the lodger's face. He stiffened, almost recoiling from the sound, then excused himself abruptly. "That's strange," Daisy said afterward. "I only laughed." "Yes," Ellen said softly. "I know." On the fourth night, while cleaning his room, Ellen made a discovery. She had knocked first, twice. No answer. He had left the house an hour earlier, she was sure of that. The bed was barely disturbed, as though he slept only lightly or not at all. But what caught her eye was the small table near the window. A notebook lay open, a pencil resting precisely parallel to its spine. Ellen did not mean to look. But the page was visible at a glance. Names. A list of women's names. Some with dates beside them. Some crossed out. Some not. Her breath caught. She leaned in, heart pounding. Just then, a creak in the hallway. Ellen froze. Footsteps approached, slow and deliberate, climbing the stairs. He had returned. Ellen snapped the notebook shut and stepped back so quickly her elbow hit the washstand. The pitcher rattled dangerously. The lodger's shadow darkened the doorway. I was just bringing fresh linens," she said, breath thin. He looked at her, really looked, his eyes cold and unreadable. The silence between them stretched long enough for Ellen to feel her pulse in her throat. After a moment, he stepped aside, allowing her to pass. "Thank you," he said softly. "Please keep the room, as I leave it." Ellen nodded quickly and hurried out, her hands trembling. Behind her, before he closed the door, she heard the sound of the notebook reopening. And then the faint scrape of pencil on paper. A new name being written. She didn't know whose. But the room seemed to exhale, as though the walls themselves felt the tension of it, the cold, growing weight of something that was no longer just odd, but dangerous. Chapter 4, The Newspaper Screams. Morning broke with an uneasy brightness, the kind that slips through heavy clouds like a blade. The fog had lifted just enough for London to regain its shape, but the clarity brought no comfort. It merely exposed the city's nerves. Daisy burst into the kitchen before Ellen had finished setting the table. "Mum, have you seen the paper?" she asked breathlessly, cheeks flushed from the brisk air. Ellen stiffened. "No." "Why?" Daisy unfolded the Evening Standard, the bold headline screaming across the front page. "The Avenger strikes again, fourth victim found before dawn." Ellen sat down slowly. Her fingertips brushed the inked letters as though they might burn her. The article beneath detailed the discovery: a young woman, barely 20, found near the riverbank. Same marks. Same pattern. Same eerie precision the killer had become known for. Daisy continued, reading aloud without the slightest sense of how the words weighed on her mother. "They say she was a dancer. Came out of rehearsal late. That's near Covent Garden, isn't it?" "It is," Ellen said faintly. "And look," Daisy pointed. "The police believe the killer may live nearby. They're asking residents to report any strange behavior." The words punched the air out of Ellen's lungs. Strange behavior. Her mind flashed instantly to the notebook. The pacing. The late-night ventures. The deliberate quiet. The way he recoiled from Daisy's laughter. "No," she told herself sharply. "You're imagining things." There were plenty of strange men in London. And plenty of reasons a man might avoid smiling portraits or laugh too little. But the knot in her stomach refused to loosen. The lodger entered the kitchen precisely at 10, as though he had timed his appearance to the minute. His presence brought a sudden hush, the kind that hangs between people who are no longer sure what they know. He wore the same dark coat, buttoned high. His gloves were folded neatly in his hand. His posture, as always, was perfectly straight. "Good morning," he said calmly. Daisy offered a bright, naive smile. "Morning. Terrible news in the paper today, did you hear?" Before Ellen could stop her, Daisy lifted the paper and held it out. The lodger's eyes flicked to the headline. Something in his expression tightened, not shock, not fear, but something closer to resignation. "Yes," he murmured. "I heard the whistles at dawn." He lowered himself into his chair. Ellen watched him closely. "You were out early, then?" she asked, tone soft but probing. He met her gaze. "I walk when I cannot sleep." A reasonable answer, yet delivered with a stillness that sent a faint tremor through her. Daisy, oblivious to the tension, continued buttering her toast. "They say the killer must know the streets very well. Maybe even grew up here." The lodger's jaw moved ever so slightly. "I suppose that's possible," he said. "Do you think they'll catch him?" Daisy asked. Again, a silence. "The kind that stretches too long." Then. "That depends," he said quietly, "on how closely they're willing to look." Ellen's hand shook slightly as she set down a plate. She didn't miss the way he kept his eyes lowered, or how his fingers clenched briefly around his teacup when Daisy laughed at one of her own jokes. She noticed everything now. It was mid-afternoon when the knock came at the door. Not the soft, measured tap of the lodger. A sharp, professional rap. Ellen opened the door to find two men on the step, one tall and broad-shouldered, the other small and sharp-eyed, with the precise manner of someone used to searching for details. "Mrs. Bunting?" the smaller man asked, tipping his hat. "Detective Sergeant Abrams, Metropolitan Police. This is Constable Hale." Ellen's breath caught. "Is this about?" "The recent occurrences," Abrams said. "We're canvassing the area again. Routine. May we come in?" Ellen nodded automatically, stepping aside. The men surveyed the front hall with quick, practiced glances. Abrams pulled out a notebook. "We understand you take in lodgers," he said. "Yes," Ellen replied. "We have one at present." "New arrival?" "2 nights ago." Abrams exchanged a look with the constable, subtle, but unmistakably alert. "Name?" Ellen hesitated. She realized, with a small shock, that she did not actually know. "He gave no surname," she confessed. "He simply said he was Mr. Slight." The constable scribbled something. "Occupation?" "He didn't say," Ellen admitted. Abrams studied her face carefully. "Does he keep odd hours, ma'am?" She froze. Her tongue stuck to the roof of her mouth. Images flickered through her mind, the pacing, the wet boots, the notebook. She forced herself to steady. "He keeps to himself." "I see," Abrams said. He closed his notebook with a quiet snap. "When he returns, kindly let him know the Metropolitan Police are conducting routine inquiries," he said. "Nothing to trouble him. Just a matter of procedure." Ellen nodded again. But her heart had begun to beat harder. The constable lingered a moment too long in the hallway, glancing up the stairs where the lodger's door lay closed. Then, without a word, the two men left. When Ellen shut the door, the house felt different. Still. Waiting. As though it understood the stakes had risen. That evening, when the lodger returned, coat glistening with fog, boots damp once more, Ellen waited in the parlor, hands clasped tightly. He paused in the doorway. "Mrs. Bunting," he said quietly, "may I inquire why the police visited?" Ellen's breath hitched. She hadn't heard him approach. "They were asking about lodgers," she said. "Routine," they claimed. His eyes narrowed. Not in anger. In calculation. "Did you give them my name?" "You didn't give a full name," she replied. A faint tension pulsed in his jaw. "I see," he said. Then, after a long, cold pause, "You may rest assured, Mrs. Bunting, that I am not the danger London should fear." Chapters 5, 6, 7, and 8, in the next video.